pandemic, people are experiencing more stress, there's anxiety around work, people are trying.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Midday Mental Health and Wellness Check-In. I'm Yolanda Stephen, the Chief Communications Officer here at the One Luther Foundation and the Center for Training and Innovation.
And I'm Stephen Thompson, the CTI Wellness Consultant. And Yolanda, today what we're going to be talking about is grief, loss, and disappointment.
Now you guys know this is a pretty heavy topic, so we want you to stay tuned, and when we come back on the other side of this break, we're going to give you some valuable tips to help you cope. Don't go away. You're tuned in to the Midday Mental Health and Wellness Check-In, and today we're talking about grief, loss, and disappointment and how you can cope with these overwhelming emotions. So, Stephen, I want to talk a little bit about the process of grief, because it is a process and you go through stages. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about what that looks like.
Right. So there are 5 stages when we think of processing grief. And so it is denial, where we're kind of denying that it's happening. And there's some anger. You may feel those emotions, those negative emotions. You also have bargaining, where it's kind of like, why me? Or can I give something instead of it happening? Then you also have depression, which is kind of where you begin to get really sad about it and whatnot. And then there's acceptance. And that's where you're finished. You've gone through the grieving process. You've accepted that it's happened. You've accepted the emotions around it. And that's how you really kind of process through the process, by being intentional. And we'll also talk a lot about, how to get to that acceptance process as well.
So is there any particular time frame? I think sometimes people put a lot of pressure on themselves and may rush through the process and not fully explore their feelings and their mindset around where they are. But is there a particular time frame, or is this unique to every person?
So definitely it's unique to every person. And something that you mentioned that's really, really important to say is that because it is unique to every person, I can't force you and you shouldn't force me. So we may all have experienced, even in a family, right? You may have, all 4 of you or so may have experienced the same loss, maybe a loss of a job or something. Everyone isn't going to go through it the same way. Someone may pitch up and be okay in 2 days. Someone may take a few months, depending on their perspective or how they receive the loss. So we have to be mindful of that, because a lot of times, especially what I see in some of the work that I do, is that some parents tend to be upset when they don't see their kids grieving in the same way that they are grieving as adults. And so we have to be mindful that even when it comes to age, kids grieve differently, adults grieve differently. It really is a matter of how you're perceiving the loss, and even just the regular resiliency and tools that you have within yourself.
Right, so a lot of it sounds like it's a coping mechanism too, and how well you're tooled to be able to do that and to move through the process in the different phases that you've spoken about. So what are some of those coping mechanisms that people can use as they transition through grief?
Yeah, so when you're talking about grief, there's so many different things you can do, but the first thing is to really be aware of it, and that's something that you're going through. And when you're aware of it, that's how you can really be intentional about it and move forward and kind of transition through the grieving process. And being aware of each stage in the grieving process is important as well. You can also, even when you're supporting others and supporting yourself, reach out to others for help. We talked a little bit about being open and empathic and listening to people when they're going through the grieving process. But it's also important, you may be able to go back to your faith. What is your faith, and how that's your source of strength and whatnot. Go back to that, go back to your roots as it relates to that, to really push through the grief and loss and even just the disappointment.
I agree with that so wholeheartedly. You have to find something to put hope in again as you struggle to get through these emotions. So we want to pause right now as well and offer our condolences to anyone that may be going through the grieving process for whatever reason. And we want to be compassionate to you, and we want to encourage our viewers to also be compassionate to those around you that may be coping with grief, loss, and disappointment. We have to be there for each other, and we have to be mindful and supportive as we all transition these new times in life and a global pandemic and everything else that's happening that's so unfamiliar. And speaking of unfamiliar, Stephen, what I do realize helps with grief is structure. Like not losing yourself in the overwhelming abyss of negative feelings, but maintaining some sort of structure around your day, around what you need to get accomplished, and keeping that sense of normalcy. So what else can people do in addition to just keeping that routine to kind of stay in the flow of life and not get lost?
Right, and I don't want to keep going over the being aware, but being aware, you have to be
it's a big
aware,
one.
right? You have to really be aware,
right.
because when you think about it, to kind of go off of that point, because you have to have structure, and especially when it comes to the grieving process, that can throw you for a loop. Right? And then you're not eating as you should, you're not sleeping as you should, you're not going to work on time. It can really impact you, and that's why you have to be really intentional on keeping that structure and keeping those different plans and things in place.
All right, and then some people may grieve different to how you and I may grieve, so there may be no symptoms. You may have someone right alongside you, and you just are unaware. So it's always good to just still maintain that level of kindness and empathy no matter what's happening.
Definitely.
But we're talking to Stephen about dealing with loss. And there has been a lot that's been lost. And I know we spoke about this in one of our earlier shows. And it was developing the sense of gratitude, like trying to still find things to be hopeful, to be happy about, even as you navigate the space of grief. If you can still cling to things that make you feel positive, that make you realize that there's still good things in the world and good people in the world, I think all of that helps to encourage you to wake up every day and to put your best foot forward. What do you think about that?
No, definitely, and I really appreciate you bringing up that point, because sometimes we may be in a dark space when we see grief or we're grieving, whether it's a loss, a disappointment, or whatever have you, and we have to kind of find the silver lining, and it's not to be overly positive about everything, but it really is to recognize that there's a balance, right? And you have to be able to see the good things that are happening, the good things that are going for you, and even if it is a loss of a loved one, to really just cherish that person, what you learned from them, what you gained from them, how they impacted your life. Those things are so important, to really give gratitude. And even to go off of that a little bit more, keeping a gratitude journal can be so helpful, just to write down some of the things that you're thankful for, just to keep you in that space of positivity instead of being bogged down in the negative things that are going on.
And that is so true, because one of the symptoms of grief also is forgetfulness. You get so absorbed in what you're going through and so internally focused that you can slip on things that you do need to do. So writing down what you need to do as well as what you want to remember to be grateful for during your process is another great tip.
Yeah, and another one I would add is to, as we talked a lot about being aware, being intentional, is to essentially plan for triggers, right? So being mindful that, a loss, if you experience a loss of a loved one, their birthdays may be a trigger for you, some other significant dates may be a trigger for you. So just kind of being mindful of those things, understanding how you need to move forward in those situations will be the best way to support yourself in moving forward in a healthy way.
Yeah, and I like that, because if you can anticipate your triggers, you can also sort of prepare yourself emotionally for what's about to happen. And I think when you get familiar enough with the process to know, hey, I'm going to feel sad. Hey, I'm going to want to cry. Hey, I'm going to feel angry. Then it's not such a shock. And you do feel more in control of your emotions that way.
Right.
So I think that's a good one as well.
Yeah. And to be able to tell other people, right? So when we think about dealing with
Tell
grief,
that to the men, right?
Yes.
A lot of times, especially women will express themselves, but you'll find a lot of times men may not have that capacity or may not feel that they can be vulnerable to express what they're going through as well. So how do we speak to that, Stephen?
I mean, honestly, like I said before, like we discussed what grief and loss is, it's a natural process. It isn't just for any gender. It's not just for men. It's not just for women. We all experience loss, and it's really about what you do with that loss. It's really about what you do with that disappointment. It's how you bounce back. It's how you show resiliency. It's how you move forward in a way that is still healthy, while still honoring that loss, but also being aware and being intentional about moving forward.
Right. Okay. Well, that sounds like really great information to put into practice as we all navigate this space. So stay tuned. We have some more tips for you on the other side of this break.
Okay, we're back, and we've been talking a little bit about grief and loss and disappointment. And what's going to be important is for us and our viewers to discuss, what it means to take care of ourselves when we're experiencing grief and loss, right? And so when we're talking about grief and loss and self-care towards that, it's really, really important, Yolanda, for us to be able to validate and feel our own emotions. Don't bottle them up, don't push them down. We have to really feel them.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Stephen. A lot of times people feel embarrassed by their emotions, but you don't have to be. We all go through things in life. We all have emotions, and you need to be able to release them and not hold them in and create a toxic environment mentally or physically for yourself.
Right, definitely. And remember now, grief and loss, that's a natural response. It's natural. It doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. everyone experiences it. So validate yourself and validate those around you that are experiencing losses as well, because like we said, self-care is also reaching out to social support and letting people know that you're grieving something or that you're having challenges with something.
Right, and you don't want to be alone. Nobody does. And the most important thing is to know that there are friends, there are family members around you that you can count on. And if you feel that you don't have those persons, then by all means, you do want to reach out and speak to a professional or to get some counseling or to get some sort of support if you need it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and definitely. And as we continue to talk about self-care when it comes to grieving losses and grieving disappointments, you want to be mindful that you can also explore tangible ways. So like talking about it, or you can be creative. So we know Bahamians are very creative people. Yes. So whether that's engaging in a craft, writing music, whatever is something that's a creative outlet for you. Trying to figure out some of those things that can really help you. I have some clients that they write rap music about their loss and what's going on, and that helps them so much because they're better able to express themselves in that creative form.
I really like that idea too, because you may pick up a new hobby. You may find some new talent that you didn't have all through this process of grieving and rediscovering yourself and how you feel. And another thing, Stephen, I want to say is that people should not feel guilty about having any sort of joy or enjoyment as they're going through the grieving process. Like, there has to be balance. You can't be all the way one way the entire time. And part of the normalcy of it is getting back to the things that you did enjoy, but not without honoring your loved one, not without taking the time to go through the process, but just understanding that you're also alive and you deserve to have joy in your life as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And that can be really challenging because some people really do feel that guilt, that guilt.
Survivor's guilt.
Right, definitely. And that can be super challenging. A lot of times that's what happens with a lot of people when they experience loss about family members and different things of that nature. And so when we think of other tips, it's also important for us to look out for our physical health, right?
Yes.
And so, sometimes when we have those losses and whatnot, we may engage in some practices or stop engaging in practices that take care of our physical health, whether that's being physically active, drinking enough water, drinking healthy foods and vegetables. Like, it's so important to be able to do that and to maintain your physical health, because how you feel on the inside is going to really impact how you feel on the outside.
Yeah, that's really good points. And then also not abusing drugs or alcohol to cope with what you're going through. I think sometimes that can be a trigger for some people. And we talked about triggers. So why don't we explain a little more about how people that are going through grief can cope with the triggers and the effects of what happens after that?
Yeah, I mean, it really is, like we discussed, if you're not aware of what's going on or even looking at, planning for those triggers, then you're gonna be lost when something does happen. If you're not planning for the fact that, hey, if I lost my mom and her birthday is coming up, I need to kind of plan for the fact that, I'm gonna be a little bit sad. I'm going to be a little bit upset. If the anniversary of their death is coming up, you really have to plan for that. And it sounds difficult to even think about that and conceptualize that. But you think about it. If you're not doing so, you'll be left in a case where you just don't know what's going on, and you may be triggered by something that can be even worse.
Of course, and taking control of your emotions and being empowered in that way is one of, I think, the most helpful things when going through grief, because you tend to feel out of control. You feel overwhelmed. You feel as though nothing will ever feel the same or feel normal again. But if you can find ways to take control and empower yourself to say, okay, yes, I acknowledge I'm feeling this way. I allow myself to feel this way, but I know that I'm going to shift my mindset. I'm going to shift how I'm processing this so that tomorrow I could feel just a little bit better, or at least I can make the effort to do so. And it's not a magical process. It's not going to happen overnight, but over time, it starts to get a little easier. And then when you start to bring back, like you said, Stephen, these different things that bring you a little bit of joy, a little bit of creativity, a little bit of hope, you start to rebuild the balance in your life. So having patience with yourself as you go through this process and as you establish this new norm for yourself is important too.
Yeah, and definitely, and I really like that you brought that up. We can do small things. It doesn't have to be, okay, now I have to take care of my physical health and go running and
get an 8-pack.
I have to do all these things,
no.
right? You can do small little things that add up. When you think of a house, right, and you think of the foundation of the house, those small blocks make up the house in the end. So it's that small self-care here, that small self-care there, those small intentional placing of the blocks is what's going to help you to move forward in a healthy way and really go through that grieving process.
Right, and the mind is so strong, Stephen. Like, I know one of my favorite sayings is, as a man thinketh, so is he. But the mind is very strong, and going through grief, sometimes you may not be able to turn off the inner voice. You may not be able to turn down the intensity of the emotions. So I think creating these experiences that take you out of that space are very helpful. And you have to be able to give that to yourself without feeling guilty or feeling selfish. So I'm excited to learn too about different ways that you can still continue this process of empowerment. Are there any more tips that our audience can use?
Yeah, I mean, definitely when you think about, we talked a little bit about seeking mental health or seeking support from a therapist or counselor or even a faith leader. I know there may be a lot of stigma around doing some of those things, but really, sometimes some people just aren't equipped to listen to someone else's grief, and you have to be mindful to be able to navigate and find those resources of someone that is better equipped. And that may be a faith leader, someone that is an actual psychologist, a counselor, a psychotherapist, and there's no shame about it. Why?
No.
Because everyone goes through grief, and sometimes we just need a little bit of help, and sometimes we just need a little bit more professional help.
Right, and you may not have anyone in your circle that can provide that to you. So absolutely reach out and get help from a professional.
Yeah, definitely. And so as we continue to kind of talk about self-care, it is really important. And we've talked about, pulling in resources,
Yes.
and we find out articles and whatnot. There's so much information on the internet about how to take care of yourself, self-care activities, ideas, things that you can do at home, things that you can go and do. And it's really, really so many resources that you can find out to really take care of yourself, regardless of what's going on.
Right, so you don't want to miss, when we come back on the other side of this break, we're going to tell you even more tips about what you can do to avoid disappointment and loss, and how to shift your mindset to be able to be in a position of control. So stay tuned. We're back for the final segment of today's Midday Mental Health and Wellness Check-In. Now, Stephen, we didn't really get to talk very much about disappointment, and I think that's something that a lot more people might be coping with now, especially in this pandemic environment. But let's just jump into disappointment.
Yeah.
How can we cope with disappointment?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so the first thing we have to do is recognize the disappointment, but also sometimes we just have to shift our perspective. You may have wanted something to happen, something to take place, and it doesn't. It's okay for you to shift your perspective. So sometimes we think of things as, it didn't happen, or what we can do is shift your perspective and say it hasn't happened yet.
I was going to say, right? Make those adjustments to your timeline and be flexible. It feels good to be flexible too, and to not be so rigid. Like being able to say, hey, there's still hope for this thing to happen. And I know for most people, you brought up earlier off camera when we were talking about all the things that have changed in this environment, and simple things we take for granted. Like even kids weren't able to go to prom, or not able to celebrate birthdays. Families weren't able to congregate and celebrate weddings. So there's been so much that has happened, and we've had to shift our expectation and understand that the reason that we're having restrictions is, of course, for the greater good, and for us to be able to push through this pandemic. But mentally, what do we tell ourselves to stay encouraged as we make these adjustments and as we attempt to be more flexible?
Right, yeah, and definitely kind of similar to grieving, you have to be mindful of validating yourself. Like, it's okay to be sad that you didn't get to go to prom. It's okay to be sad that you were supposed to go off to school next year, but you're not going because of what's going on in the world. You have to tell yourself that it's okay. You have to give yourself permission to be disappointed, because sometimes we bottle it down and we say, well, I'll get it next time, but acknowledge that it's not a good feeling that it didn't happen.
Right, and don't judge anyone else on what they're disappointed about. Like, allow people to feel what they're feeling. I think that's really important. Don't say, hey, you can't feel disappointed, because that's not important in the scope of what we're going through in the world today. No, people still have emotions. They still had different expectations from you or I. So give them the space to be able to go through that.
Yeah, definitely. And really what one can do is to reframe. So that's just looking at a situation differently, looking at that disappointment in a different way. Kind of, if it's you getting a no, recognizing that means someone else probably got a yes, right? So kind of being a part of understanding that just because you got a no and it didn't happen for you, it may have happened for someone else, and you will and probably will be able to get that yes later on.
See, I like what you said, because some people may look at that and be like, I'm mad. They got a yes and I got a no. But maybe what that can be is if they got the yes, maybe the second time you ask, you'll get the yes.
Right, and you might get the better yes. You may get the yes that you really, really want. Or you may be even in that situation, that thing that you wanted so badly, maybe just wasn't for you.
Right? Maybe you'll be redirected to something even better.
Yeah, but being disappointment is a part of life. We all have experienced disappointment even more so now, but it is a part of life where there's ups and downs and things that we go through that make us just not feel so great, and we're looking forward to certain things. But really, like we've been saying, is, you know, and we're going to say this a lot, is to be intentional about recognizing it and being aware of how does that make you feel, what's going on, and then moving forward. And something else that we talked a little bit off camera as well was choices and the matter and the idea of, you know, what do you have in your control? What's in your control, and how do you choose to move forward in that way?
That's a big one. At least being able to take control of your circumstances surely makes you feel that you have more to choose from. You have more authority in deciding what your day and your life and your plans look like. So sometimes maybe what it is just picking up those pieces and rearranging them from the disappointment puzzle to something else, some other tapestry, something else that's still equally as beautiful but different from your original plans.
Yeah, and as I've said before, and as we've said, it's easier said than done, right? Because sometimes we want that thing to be in our control. We want to be the person that is, you know, getting that thing that we want, and then when it doesn't happen, we're disappointed. And so sometimes you just kind of have to sit back and recognize that, you know, this is out of my control. There's no use in getting, you know, flustered or overly upset about it. Those are validating yourself, but recognizing that I can't do anything about it. You know, I can't do anything now, and I have to kind of let it go.
Yeah, just let it go.
Thank you for joining another episode of the Midday Mental Health and Wellness Check-In. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe our social media below. And until next time,
We'll see you soon.